In the 1960s, LSD was like psychiatry's wild child, a molecule that promised enlightenment, but then it ended up on America's Most Wanted list. It started in sterile hospital labs and research centers, not in basements or at music festivals. Psychiatrists and neuroscientists believed LSD could be a window into the mind. It was looked at as a potential way to treat alcoholism, depression, and even just the fear of death and dying. Then came the chaos, right? The counterculture, the government panic, and a moral war that slammed the door on psychedelic research for nearly 50 years. But here we are again. The same drug that once symbolized rebellion is back in clinical trials. Not as a party drug, but as a treatment for real suffering. Because a single dose of LSD is now being studied for generalized anxiety disorder, meaning one single dose can help you for months afterward. Another study found it can reduce depression for months at a time. And researchers at places like Johns Hopkins and Yale are reopening the conversation psychiatry once shut down. Not just psychiatry, but also the government and just people. The question isn't why LSD is being studied again. The question is what ever made us stop? What made psychiatry, the very field built on curiosity about the human mind, turn away from one of the most profound consciousness-altering tools ever discovered? Maybe because LSD didn't just expand perception. It expanded power. And that scared people. Or maybe because what it revealed about the human mind didn't fit neatly inside a diagnosis or a billing code or a pharmaceutical model of some type. Whatever the reason, we're back at the beginning. Same compound, new caution, new ways of testing, better ways of testing, and we're more informed this time. The goal isn't to make you hallucinate. It's to help you heal. So, how does LSD actually work? On paper, it's simple chemistry. LSD is a compound that fits perfectly into the brain's serotonin 2A receptor, like a master key sliding into a lock it was somehow meant to find. But what happens next is anything but simple. LSD doesn't just activate the brain, it unlocks it. It temporarily disrupts one of our most tightly guarded systems, which is the default mode network, which is the part of the brain that keeps your sense of you separate from everything else in the universe. That feeling that you're separate from everything else in the universe. That's the network responsible for self-talk, identity, rumination, even shame. It's what gives us a coherent sense of self. But it can also trap us inside it. Under LSD, that network quiets down, and suddenly, brain regions that normally never speak to each other start lighting up like a city that could be seen from space. Meaning 1,000 new conversations are happening in your brain all at once. And you might not be aware of it, but there are networks and synapses firing and connecting that have never been able to connect before. It's like the orchestra of the mind loses its conductor for a few hours. At first, that sounds chaotic. It can sound scary. The violins blur into the horns. The percussion crashes out of sync, but then something strange happens. New melodies emerge, unheard harmonies, connections that were always there waiting to be made, but never allowed to play together. That's the neuroscience of LSD. Increased neural entropy, meaning more flexibility, less rigidity. The brain, for a brief window of time, becomes more fluid. And that's why researchers believe it might help people whose mental patterns have become locked in depression, in anxiety, in trauma. Not by erasing who you are at all, but by letting your brain remember that change is still possible. Because imagine a life defined by loops, like negative thoughts, fears, compulsions, and then suddenly the loop breaks. Not because the pain disappears, but because your mind finally sees another route out. That's what LSD might offer, a neurological fresh start. Neuroplasticity. Not a permanent fix, not magic, but maybe a window or a different perception. A few hours where the walls that felt permanent become a little more see-through, a little more transparent. And through that window, if the therapy and support are there, something can finally start to shift. For decades, LSD was locked away. It was called a Schedule I with no accepted medical use. But that phrase, no accepted use, was never quite the same as no potential use. Today, the potential is finally being tested again. MindMed, which is a biotech company out of Switzerland, and they have a company or a satellite in New York, just launched the first ever phase 3 trial of LSD for generalized anxiety disorder. It's the largest psychedelic study in history. Hundreds of participants monitored in clinical settings with structured therapy before and after the treatment. And here's the wild part. Early data suggests that a single dose of LSD, around 100 micrograms, can reduce anxiety symptoms for 3 months or more. Not daily medication, not weekly therapy, one guided experience. That kind of sustained relief doesn't mean LSD cures anxiety, but it tells us something big, that when the mind is given a chance to reset, even briefly, the patterns underneath fear can start to reorganize. Another company called Mind Biotherapeutics is testing a different approach, microdosing or using ultra-low daily doses of LSD that don't cause hallucinations. Their phase 2A trial showed measurable improvements in mood and motivation in people with depression without impairing function or perception. In other words, there is no trip, just traction, just connection, just neuroplasticity. But you're not hallucinating, you're not tripping. Meanwhile, academic centers like Johns Hopkins, Yale, and Imperial College London are mapping what happens during those LSD sessions on brain scans, which is super important. fMRI and MEG studies show that LSD increases cross-network connectivity. The brain's regions start talking to one another in ways they normally don't. So that's how you can see things differently, or start to see things differently. The same neural flexibility that helps people feel connected to everything in the universe under LSD may also help them feel connected to themselves afterward. It's not the molecule alone doing the healing, right? It's what the molecule allows, that brief state of neuroplastic openness, and what you do with it in therapy that determines whether it becomes integration or confusion. LSD isn't being studied to make people hallucinate. It's being studied to help them reconnect, to loosen the knots of rumination, to reawaken emotion that depression numbs, to give the mind a glimpse of its own flexibility again. Maybe the future of psychiatry isn't about numbing pain. Maybe it's about expanding capacity and changing perception and trusting the brain to find new routes to healing when we finally stop over-controlling it. Now, it's easy to romanticize LSD, as you can see, to think of it as a miracle molecule, a cosmic reset button, or a fast track to enlightenment. But that's not how healing works. LSD isn't a shortcut. It's a catalyst. And catalysts can burn just as easily as they can illuminate. In clinical settings, LSD can induce profound emotional openings, but it can also bring buried trauma to the surface too fast for that same reason, or overwhelm the nervous system if the container isn't safe. People with bipolar spectrum disorders or psychotic vulnerabilities can decompensate under LSD, not because the drug creates psychosis by any means, but because it dismantles the boundaries that keep perception anchored, typically. It can also trigger panic, dissociation, or sensory overload if the environment, what researchers call set and setting, isn't carefully structured. That's why modern studies look so different from the free-for-all experiments of the past. Participants now are medically screened. Sessions are guided by trained therapists who are interested in psychedelic treatment. There's preparation before, integration afterward. Every variable, lighting, sound, even the therapist's demeanor, is part of the medicine. LSD can open doors that shouldn't be opened alone. It can loosen defenses that were protecting a mind not ready to face what's underneath. That's why it's not a home remedy, not a self-experiment, not a solo healing journey on a random weekend. Even in research settings, outcomes vary widely. Not everyone finds relief, and some experiences cause distress that lasts for weeks. And from a research standpoint, LSD's intensity makes true placebo control nearly impossible. You can't really blind someone to whether they're tripping or not. That makes the data complex and the hype risky. The psychedelic renaissance isn't just about discovery. It's about humility. Because every time psychiatry has rushed toward a miracle cure, we've created new wounds, from lobotomies to benzos to over-medication. We can't afford to keep repeating that cycle. So as we study LSD again, the goal isn't to worship it. It's just to understand it and how it works. To use it, if it truly heals, with the same reverence we give anesthesia or surgery, powerful, risky, and life-changing when done correctly. LSD is not light or dark. It's not good or bad. It's a tool, one that can build a bridge across the mind or burn one, depending on who's holding the torch. The story of LSD is the story of psychiatry itself. It's full of brilliance, fear, miracles, overreach, tragedy, and rediscovery. In the 1950s, LSD was medicine. Psychiatrists in Canada and the US used it to treat alcoholism, depression, and existential despair. Patients described breakthroughs that years of therapy hadn't touched. It was thought to mimic psychosis back then, and doctors believed that by temporarily inducing altered states of consciousness, they could understand what their patients were living with every day, which isn't true. Then the 1960s came. The same drug that was being used to heal veterans and terminal patients found its way into college dorms and protest movements. LSD stopped being seen as a window into the mind and started being seen as a threat to the system. By 1970, it was banned, and just like that, a generation of research disappeared into political exile. It's strange to think about, isn't it? A medicine that might have helped millions was buried. Not because it failed, but because we lost our nerve. For 50 years, psychiatry avoided psychedelics. We built a model that felt safer and based it around fear. Diagnosis, medication, control. But somewhere along the way, we also lost something. Our curiosity. We forgot that the mind isn't just circuitry. It's mystery. And LSD, for better or worse, refuses to let us forget that. Now, as the psychedelic renaissance unfolds, we're watching psychiatry make the same pilgrimage it made a century ago. From fear to curiosity. From control to connection. From chemical restraint to chemical expansion. If you listen closely, you can hear echoes of every era before this one. The optimism of insulin coma therapy, the hubris of lobotomy, the rebirth of ECT, the redemption of ketamine. Every time psychiatry swings too far one way, history pulls it back. LSD isn't the first drug to make us ask what consciousness really is, but it might be the one that forces us to admit we still don't know. Maybe that's the real medicine here. The humility to look at the mind and say, we're still learning. LSD challenges psychiatry's comfort zone. It reminds us that healing doesn't always happen through suppression. Sometimes it happens through expansion. For decades, psychiatry tried to contain the mind, to name, label, and medicate its chaos into order. But LSD asks us to reconsider whether the goal is control or connection. The research is promising, but it's not ready for the mainstream. These compounds demand structure, safety, and skilled integration in people who are willing to take it seriously. They are not shortcuts, and they are not for everyone at all. Yet the data, the neuroimaging, and the patient stories all point to the same possibility, that flexible brains heal better than rigid ones. As clinicians, our role is to walk that edge carefully, open-minded, but anchored in reality, and anchored in evidence, curious, but not careless. If we do it right, LSD won't just reopen a door to psychedelics, it will reopen something bigger. Psychiatry's willingness to wonder again. LSD was never really about escape. It was about perspective. For some, it opens a window, a glimpse into the vastness of mind and meaning that lies beyond our daily grind of thought loops and labels. For others, it becomes a mirror, forcing them to see what they've avoided, what they've buried, what still aches beneath the surface. And maybe that's why it scares people. Because LSD doesn't just change what you see, it changes what you can't unsee. It reveals that consciousness isn't tidy, it's infinite. And that the borders we've built around it, both clinically and personally, were never meant to be walls. Just temporary fences while we learned to navigate the terrain. The real revolution isn't LSD itself. It's what it represents. Psychiatry daring to re-enter the unknown with humility instead of hubris. It's the reminder that science and soul were never enemies. They were always meant to meet somewhere in the middle, in that place where the measurable and the mystical overlap. Maybe LSD won't heal everyone. It might not heal the world. Maybe it'll just help us remember that healing isn't linear, though, and that the mind is more ocean and fluid than it is machine and structure. And maybe, just maybe, this time we'll walk into that ocean with our eyes open, our data ready, and our hearts ready enough to hold both the wonder and the risk of what LSD is. Because psychiatry doesn't need another miracle drug, but it needs its courage back.